All right, it is 5:30. Good evening. I'd like to call our virtual work session for fiscal year 22 budget presentation to order. I also want to mention that Director Vengadaslam is going to be absent this evening. Dr. Watts, would you please begin our presentation?
Absolutely. Thank you, President Daniels, members of the board, staff, Ms. Halley, and team. It is my pleasure to introduce our Chief Accountability Officer, Dr. Jewel Harmon, and Executive Director Ben Rarick to begin our presentation this evening. Team, the floor is yours.
Good evening, President Daniels, members of the board, Dr. Watts, and Ms. Howley. This is our second presentation of FY22 budget, and as we mentioned at our last work session, we were going to come back with answers to some of your what-ifs, additional information about additional funding for the district that would impact FY22, and then spend some time talking about board director priorities for budget. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Executive Director Rarick. So we will start right away and use the best of our time wisely.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Okay, how do we do? Somewhat less eventful than the last time. Okay, great. Okay, good afternoon or good evening, Dr. Watts, Dr. Harmon, members of the board, Ms. Howley. As Jewel was just saying, we have a work session number 2 presentation for you, coming closely on the heels, obviously, of work session number 1. One thing I would like to say is that typically in work session number 2, the legislature has convened and we typically have some hard information to share about revenues. And we just don't have that yet. So we're kind of in a middle step at this point. I'll share what I can. So tonight's topics include the following 4 things. The first is that I think it was Member Vengadaslam that was asking about CARES Act allowable uses and wanting a little bit more of an in-depth review of that. So I spent quite a bit of time on that, and I do have new information and information in greater depth that I think will answer some of your questions. We will have some discussion about core values and budget priorities. We will talk about kind of as we go into the process of budgeting for ESSER funds, some budgeting principles, given the conversation we had about allowable uses. I am able to come back to you and talk to you a little bit more about some of the questions you asked with regards to the fee schedule. We had a robust conversation about student family fees, what they're for, why they're for, et cetera. And so I have done some exploration in that regard. And finally, we'll talk about next steps in the process. Okay. So the first series of slides really are intended to give you, you'll remember from the last presentation, I gave you that matrix that outlined amounts, deadlines, and brief explanations of allowable uses. The feedback from the board members at that time was that they wanted a little bit more robust information about allowable uses. So I've got about 3 or 4 slides on that. A couple key points, basic principles that might be reviewed because it went out in the board update last week. But nevertheless, for the benefit of the group, ESSER funds are administered on a claim basis. So we'll never actually kind of get a standard monthly allocation and the money won't sit in our bank account. We will make expenditure claims. We will spend something, we will make a claim for expenditure with OSPI, and that will be approved or not approved. So that's kind of mechanically how that works. There's a couple of basic principles on allowability, and I go from high level to increasingly low level. At the high level, it's true of all federal funds, not just ESSER, that expenditures under this program must be deemed necessary and reasonable under the circumstances of the Act. And that obviously is a very broad term. ESSER is an unusually broad category of federal expenditure. In that, for example, any activity that's authorized under any of our existing federal funding programs is automatically kind of grandfathered into ESSER. So anything we do under ESEA, IDEA, Perkins, McKinney-Vento, if we have a federal program and we spend money on allowable activities in that program, then automatically those activities kind of extend into the ESSER environment as well. But it goes beyond that to say basically that, you know, the purpose of the act is to address, mitigate, strategize about the effects of COVID-19. So it includes such things as purchasing supplies and materials to provide clean and safe facilities, plan for and coordinate the delivery of instruction and services, you know, through the various phases. So through remote learning, then through a successful transition of, you know, sort of hybrid models, and then ultimately to a fully robust 100% in-person instruction. You can use it in all of those phases as long as you're demonstrating that your expenses are meant to build the quality of those stages. And then finally, expenses associated with addressing learning loss among the student body, including extended day and or summer learning programs. Okay, but it gets more detailed than that. Okay. So now I'm going to show you some materials that I received from some of my contacts in the field. This came from a study, kind of an analysis that was commissioned by the American Association of School Administrators. So this is not from the state of Washington, keep that in mind. But this is a very reputable group of attorneys that specialize in interpreting federal education law and regulations. So I include a little note there in the very bottom that says that not all the language that you see has been transmitted to us by OSPI, but we can be pretty confident that this reputable national firm has a good grasp of what the statute says. The first slide here is just kind of an overarching philosophy, and that is that according to the ED guidance, activities supported with ESSER must relate to preventing, preparing for, and responding to COVID-19. And their guidance to district is just be sure, like you can construe that liberally, but be ready to tell your story and explain the connection to COVID-19 in the expenditures that you claim. Okay. Now some more details. ESSER 1, 2, and 3 obviously involve different amounts of authorization, as we went over in the last board meeting. But ESSER 3 has a new requirement not present prior to, which is that at least 20% of the money must be spent to address learning loss through implementation of evidence-based intervention. So it's a little interesting that we got the first wave of money in ESSER 1, and we get a sizable allocation or eligibility for claim in ESSER 2. And it isn't until ESSER 3 that they earmark a 20% provision. Okay. They're also very explicit about the fact that in their view, and they confirmed this with US Ed staff, that this is the broadest language that they have in any federal funding program, and that common restrictions that apply to most all federal programs do not apply in this case. This is key. This is a key thing to understand here as we get into the next slide. So common restrictions that sometimes apply to regular federal programs like our title programs do not necessarily apply in this case. One of them is, for example, programs that have to benefit a certain group of kids. Many of those requirements are waived. So there's unique flexibility here. So one of those unique flexibilities is reflected on this slide. This is where I'm going to kind of call your attention to this caveat language down below. I have emailed OSPI and sought some of their response to this federal analysis. I haven't heard back yet, but some of the information I learned was some revelation to me. So this is going to be new for me and for you. And that is that according to this attorney group, the ESER language can be used for beyond general fund claims, which is what we were originally led to believe, that we could only claim through a general fund expense, but could include things like buses, which should be purchase those through the transportation vehicle fund, modular classrooms, real property acquisition, and a variety of other costs that are capital in nature, so long as certain conditions are met. And the basic condition is that you have to draw that link between, referring back to that previous slide, what is your connection to preventing, preparing, and responding to COVID-19? So it isn't just any capital project that you want to do, any modular classroom what you want to add, but you're going to have to meet some level of demonstration that there's a connection to the response to COVID-19. Okay. Particularly as it relates to buses, that was absolutely news to me and several of my colleagues. And it was not necessarily among the first wave of information that went out to districts. So I think, like everyone else, OSPI is coming to grips with what this new law means. But one of the things that the law does say, which is not included in here, but is that were districts to invest in anything of this kind in terms of capitalized expenses, there would need to be a pre-approval process. So the state education agency is supposed to set up a process where instead of the district making an expense and making the claim, that they would pre-approve it before the district ever made the claim, which is a little bit of a different technique than what we might use for all of the other claims. Okay, so any questions about the previous two slides before I get into some ESER budgeting principles?
Mr. Rarick.
Yes.
Leslie Hamada. First of all, I'm curious on the overall 1, 2, and 3. Once you sent in your bill for reimbursement, how long does it take for those fundings to be reimbursed and placed back into our accounts?
Not long at all.
Oh, it's pretty rapid.
Yeah.
And is there an occasion where that could be refused if we didn't quite know what we were doing or didn't do it right, and you would know right away, or how would that be handled? Yeah, well, I guess the only way I can answer that is based on the experience that we had in ESER 1. So what they do is they ask for a general budget. They were very clear with the districts that we know you're going to change your budget because it was an emerging situation. We made claims and were reimbursed within the same cycle. So we were, if we made a claim in April, we were typically reimbursed within the same month. So that gives me the sense that they're not like auditing each item in the moment, but auditing on the back end. So it's a pretty seamless process. Now, for this sort of thing, where they're saying that the state education agency has to create a pre-approval process, that applies to me just exactly what your question kind of implies, which is that you could maybe submit something and say, hey, I want to, buy a school bus to increase the social distancing that I'm able to accommodate within our current fleet or something. Mm-hmm. And maybe they say no. I'm not sure on what basis they would say no, but that's the only reason for having a pre-approval process, right? So it seems like they're taking the capital part of this and creating a slightly different structure and process, but we don't know what that looks like yet. So that, I guess that's a pending item. So in essence, you probably wouldn't be out that money because you kind of like have a pre-approval for like a medical claim. And that's probably the reason for it, frankly, is that, if you claim $1,000 in masks, there's not a tremendous amount of risk for the district. But if you go out and buy something that's, yeah. And what is the 20% of the SR3s? Roughly what dollar amount does that equate to? So if you'll give me a minute, I'm going to have to go back into my previous work session PowerPoint here real quick. But I think off the top of my head,
ESSER3 was going to be about like 56, 57 million.
Mm-hmm.
So 20% of that might be 11, 12 million bucks.
In your opinion, is that an adequate amount to be set aside for loss of learning? I mean, only 20%?
Yes. So, well, I'll in my opinion.
Yeah, right.
So I will, yeah, so I'm going to defer to Dr. Watson, Dr. Harmer about some of the larger strategic goals of the district, but I will say that certainly, as we have talked about the first phase of spending ESSER2, you know, programs for students to address learning is like the first thing that we're talking about. So it's not like we're going to wait to ESSER3 to, right? It's really like, it's kind of odd, frankly, how the law came down, that they kind of thought about this in the last version of ESSER, but the language around ESSER2 and some of the kind of the, what you might call like the strategic communication and visioning from the federal government and Congress around ESSER2 focuses on like extended day summer programs and learning loss mitigation strategies like tutoring or whatever it might be. So it would not be my, you know, I don't want to get out ahead of everybody here, but it certainly wouldn't be my expectation that we would wait till the expenditure of ESSER3 to start addressing learning loss. I think it's going to be part of the first wave of expenditure. In what proportion is a different matter.
In addition to what Ben just shared, OSPI also, as part of the reopening plans, requested that school districts submit a larger plan due by June 1st to address academic acceleration, or as they called it initially in the request, learning loss or learning gaps. And so how our ESSER funds 2 and 3 are spent will be heavily driven by the plans in that June 1st due date. So we are already beginning to have just preliminary conversations about what that strategy looks like, and immediately addressing student needs. So what does direct support for students look like? As we develop that, we are going to bring along our principals and our staff to help do that. It'll be driven by data of where, you know, students are possibly credit deficient or core standard deficient in terms of those pieces. And so all of that will come together, but we are in the preliminary stages of that because we're still living it. And one of the benefits of this is that we have, from this point, 2.5 years to spend that money. And so we want to make sure that we have a plan that is multifold, obviously supporting students, but that will have impact over that 2 to 3 year time and beyond, and then is sustainable in our budget so that whatever we implement extends and is able to be sustained beyond the ESSER funding. So for example, quite a few things are allowable, but if we were to add or make huge investments in program expansion or staffing, we need to have a plan to continue to maintain that staff out of general fund once ESSER dollars are gone. So thinking about all of that as we build this.
And that might be a good segue into the next slide, actually, which is that.
Can I ask one question really quickly? So as far as SR2 funds, are we now eligible and or have we claimed any SR2 funds?
I can answer the second part of that. We have not claimed any SR2 funds yet. I had a call placed down to OSPI about your first question, and I have not received a return call just yet, but I think maybe Jewel has something to share there.
Yes, she does.
So we have received notification from Superintendent Reimbursement that our learning minutes in our plan meet the requirements. However, we've not received anything in terms of a formal document that says so, so we're not drawing down any funds until we've received that, other than the email from Superintendent Reimbursement saying so. Okay. And so right now we haven't made any claims, partially because we haven't received that formal documentation. The other piece of this is that although we can start spending dollars immediately, again, we want to make sure that we have a plan and that our spending is related to a long-term strategy, not just immediate spending and need.
Great.
But no, we have not.
Thank you.
So some of your questions are, I think, going kind of in the same spirit as this slide, which is that.
Real quick, Director Benno has a question, I believe.
Oh,
so
I'm
before we
sorry.
move on.
I just have a
thank
comment.
You for doing that, because I'm not seeing like the chats. And
I just want to, I appreciate you, Dr. Harmon, and your comment talking about learning acceleration or learning enrichment versus learning loss. And I always publicly want to say our educators have worked really hard the last year, and to put it kind of to like this imaginary like place where all students are supposed to be when the key thing is trying to survive a pandemic, and also trying to get them the learning that they can with the technology that they can. And so I think language is important. So I know that the ESSER funds call it learning loss, but I also really appreciate when we look at it, language is valid and important. That enrichment or acceleration, I think, is a better terminology than learning loss, just to respect our educators and the people who have worked really hard to make sure that our students are getting what they need during a pandemic.
Thank you, Director Benno. We don't know if it'll take root, but we've been talking about it as acceleration. So,
yeah, and I'll try to too. Frankly, it's just that a lot that I'm drawing from the federal regulations, and I don't want to get too creative because I'm trying to reiterate kind of more the legal requirement. But anyway, point well taken. I get it, and I will try to amend my language. So anyway, to the point of the 5 guiding principles. I wanted to share some of the initial thinking about how to approach, how we might approach this opportunity. The first one is quite clear, which is that, you know, a kind of focus question for all expenditures is, does it relate to preventing, preparing for, and responding to COVID-19? Now, districts are taking a very liberal construction of that, but nevertheless, if we were to get audited on the back end, if any district were to get audited, that essentially would be like, answer that question for me. When you did A, how did it prevent, prepare for, or respond to COVID-19? But they've been very clear that providing a robust, high quality program of teaching and learning during this transition period is de facto responding to COVID-19. So that alone really makes it quite broad, and therefore more easy to navigate by districts. The second thing is a consideration to limiting long-term commitments with short-term funding. So, and this is a particularly acute challenge for some of the larger districts that are receiving the larger sums under ESSER, because staffing is what, 80 to 85% of our budget. And yet this is a fairly significant investment in our schools. So there is a bit of a dichotomy there. So this really presents a unique opportunity to make investments in kind of our district infrastructure in terms of one-time investments in what we can do and provide for students and families, as opposed to, for example, just hiring a bunch of staff, right, and then finding yourself on the back. Not to say that you couldn't hire any staff, but you have to really carefully calibrate, what you're getting yourself into when that funding expires. 3 would be really, we just spent a bunch of time talking about the capital costs and whatever, but obviously the kind of salient point here is, what are the things that we can do that directly impact students and their experience in our school, and try to reverse maybe some of the, well, to use Director Bento's language, to activate the acceleration that we want to see in the learning of our students. So I try to let that be the guide and figure out the practical and regulatory things kind of as second and third considerations, but that's really kind of the genesis, if you will, and the purpose of the law. The 4th is to ramp down rather than ramp up, which probably requires some explanation there in terms of what I mean. But I did attend a discussion in which, people, job alikes in my field, were talking about what does the shape of this look like? Meaning, do you ramp up spending year 1, year 2, year 3? Do you try to smooth it out, or do you ramp it down? And ideally, from a sustainability standpoint, ideally, you want to smooth and perhaps ramp down a little bit at the end so that when you get to the end of the program, that so-called fiscal cliff that you might experience is less profound than if you tried the, this model, where you're spending a little bit in year one, more in year two, and then by year three, you're really spending, and then you're back all the way. So trying to smooth and mitigate the cliffs that would that come from any substantial investment in our system is a consideration.
Ben, really quickly, I think Director Hamada has a question related.
Okay, thank you for pointing these out because I can't see them, so I appreciate it.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Rarick, but if you are accelerating learning or trying to perhaps go over and reiterate some information or programming or whatever that kids didn't pick up while they were going through it, eventually it should not take for eternity for them to catch up and be ready to even fly from that. So in reality, a boost of money can help, pick up that gap, but then they should be able to literally fly on their own, right? And be back up to speed, and we wouldn't have to, when you're saying we have to level this off, I can see that in some things, but if you accelerate it for a couple of years and you get people all caught up with where they need to be, then their actual need for loss, I'm going to have to use the word loss if there is loss, should be back up to standard and you'd be just business as usual, right?
Well, that's a rich discussion about the nature of learning, and I have lots of personal opinions about that, but I think I would defer to Dr. West and Dr. Harmon, because I've heard both philosophies expressed about how difficult it is to use Director Bento's phrase, sustain the acceleration that that you want to. So I'm not going to be the teaching and learning expert here.
I won't pretend to be. It's been quite some time since I was in a classroom, but I will say that the learning curve is relative. And I'll give an example this way. So I say helping a secondary student, a high school student, accelerate gaps or understandings around Algebra 2 when they may have had a firm foundation in Algebra 1 is very different. And I think the timing or the distance to gain that ground and fly on their own might be different than a student who is missing foundational keys and then being able to fly. So imagine the impact of, I think about it personally, of a kindergartner who's missed some of those key foundational concepts of just school in general and picking that up. So that may take additional time compared to a student who already has a foundation and is taking the second or third iteration of an expansion of a topic or a content area. So in a simple form, yes, these funds are absolutely a shot in the arm to help accelerate our students, but I won't say that it's flat and going to be the same learning curve for all students across all grade levels. So plus, if the strategies that we implement or programs that we expand work, if they are acceptable and amenable to our community and they are showing outcomes for our students, it's going to be hard pressed to argue for discontinuing them just because the money ran out. So that's another reason why we want to think about strategically what we're implementing, how we're doing that, and then how we continue it if it's bearing fruit and showing positive outcomes.
Well, I'm thinking too that a lot of nonprofits might have a hard time in the beginning, bringing in extra staff to do things. And if somehow or other that's paid by the school district and they can get a solid ground underneath them, then perhaps our community could carry that through a partnership and we could kind of step out with the funding and they could step in. Those are potentials I see. Thank you.
And then the final, I think I got through 4, the final point, which is that, to think creatively and broadly. Because the language is broad and it's intentionally broad, and staff from USED have literally spoken to the intentional broadness of it, which is important to know. It feels like school districts are being challenged in a good way to think innovatively and strategically in how they can use these funds to create opportunities for students. Well, so I find this very energizing. I think that this is kind of not typical of the experience I've had with federal funding, where the rules can get quite intricate and you have to have full-time staff just to figure out what can happen within a particular program. This really feels like districts are being challenged from a strategic standpoint in a very positive way. So I think it's a great thing. I think potentially to take advantage of for our community. Any questions about kind of these principles of budgeting before I move on? All right, so I'm going to transition the conversation at this point to some of the questions that you asked, some of the scenarios you posed during our last work session. But before I do, any other ESER comments, questions, or concerns?
I mean, I have a comment. I have comments because like creative thinking, I got you on creative thinking. So like if there's a plan or a need for looking at how we can be creative, like there's so many ideas of things that I've heard from all around, things that totally support students. So I'm just going to throw that out there because I could throw many ideas. If they're good or not, I don't know, but there's lots of creative ideas flowing in this brain. So I'm happy to help where I can.
Director Benno, all directors will have some time at the end, in just a few minutes, to share and talk about priorities or interest as it relates to budgeting for FY22. So you'll have an opportunity to share some of those, and that won't be your only opportunity, but you'll have time to add that.
Thank you so much.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about, so I introduced the concept of student family fees at the last work session, and to my it engendered a significant amount of discussion. So I'm coming back to you now with a little bit more in-depth analysis and discussion. Tried to catalog the questions that you asked, some of which I'm able to answer, some of which I have to kind of approximate a little bit, but will nevertheless move the ball forward. So a couple things are happening here. First of all, the last time I just showed you this slide. This was the middle school fee schedule. Now I'm going to show you, by the way, this is a link that's available in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, which I believe you have access to. This is something that is public and that we created that didn't exist before, just as a way of getting an overview of what are we dealing with as a community in terms of these fees, who's charging them, why they're charging them, why they differ. So this is the middle school schedule. And then this is the high school fine and fee schedule as it relates to ASB specifically. Okay, I'm not going to go over every line here, but just wait a second here. And then the third one is the general fund fees, which I think I want to focus some of our conversation here, which pertain to fees charged for certain classes, which is one of the things that we talked about in our last segment. Okay, and so what I want to do is first kind of talk you through what we've done to this point already on this slide, and then the next slide I'll talk about directions we could potentially go. Let's put it that way. I'm very careful in the slides about directions we could potentially go, that when you're talking about hundreds of fees, there's got to be a recognition that, first of all, there's very good reasons for charging fees in certain cases, right? So just kind of a sweeping exemption is not a thoughtful approach. And also that there's a lot of people involved, just starting with the principals, but oftentimes staff within the buildings where there's a deep, rich history behind each one of these. So it is going to be a process that will require, like more deliberation with our principal partners, and probably even deeper than that. But I think it's an important conversation to have. So I welcome the opportunity. So first, let's talk about steps we've already taken. First of all, the creation of the consolidated district fee schedule. Second of all, to include the schedule in the annual budget review. Third of all, we revised the student fee board procedure, which was considerably out of date. Fourth, we eliminated all CTE class program fees. So if you're taking a CTE class, you shouldn't be charged a fee. And just yesterday, I discovered there's one school. We got one school still charging fees, and we're going to reimburse it. So, but that practice should be done. 5, we eliminated all ASB card fees for this school year. And I think I took you through this before, but the thinking and philosophy was that, first of all, in recognition, I think, of all that families and students have been through this year, but it felt awkward. It just felt awkward from a business standpoint to be charging an ASB fee like in May, when a lot of the activities, would have already, in a typical year, would have already transpired. Just didn't feel right. So this year, the general fund subsidized all cards for all students. And we were able to do that. 6, and now I'm kind of getting beyond ASB. I received an email from a student about this like a couple days ago. We reimbursed. So last year we got ourselves in a situation where we were in March, I think it was, when the pandemic hit. I think schools, am I right about that? It was March into April, the schools shut down. So there were a lot of fees that had been charged that year for events that were to occur in the spring and summer months. And the accounting staff spent literally weeks reimbursing all of those fees. And then the strategy for this year was to not charge those fees because it took a ton of time to reimburse them. So the approach was that we either reimbursed the fee. A lot of cases, there was an option for the family. You got the fee reimbursed, like we sent you a check, or it stayed on account, right? You just say, like, have a student who's going to be in the system for a while, and the reimbursement's like $15, and they could just have a credit on their account. But for anybody who wanted it reimbursed, we just reimbursed it. And then finally, we did, I see Wade is on the call. We did have a couple of robust discussions with the principals, particularly the secondary principals. Robust is a good term, about the history of fees and why they vary and why they are. And, it was an opportunity to share that, one of the things that came out that, well, it's, the procedure was pretty antiquated, which is what compelled us to rewrite that procedure. But that those two discussions, which happened pre-COVID, were important to this work. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the questions that you posed at the last session and what might be some different directions that we can look at. Again, I hope I just want to emphasize here that anything that we do would really need some vetting from our school-based leaders, because they're the ones that really know the fees, the nature of them, the reason for them. But first of all, I think it's completely worthy undertaking to take a look at our philosophy for fees associated with classes. In many cases, we charge a fee for what we call consumables. And what that means is something that the student is going to use. It's not a fixed asset necessarily. It's not like a computer they're going to turn back in, but it's a workbook or something. And I know districts have different philosophies with regards to what students get charged for, but one thing that we could look at is rethinking our philosophy about subsidizing consumable materials. Now, of course, once the school hears about this, they're going, well, that'd be great, but we need the money, right? There's a reason we charge the fee, which is to pay for that consumable. So it is an additional cost to the budget, but in keeping with our core values as a district, there is a certain coherence to the statement that, okay, if you're taking a class in the Kent Public School District, and again, there will be certain appropriate exemptions to this, but if you're taking a class in the Kent School District, we're not going to charge you for any of the materials, consumable or otherwise, that may be necessary for that class. I have heard of a couple of examples that maybe you go, okay, well, maybe in that case, yeah, that's an appropriate fee. But by and large, I think that's worth really taking a strict look at. Slicing this data is difficult. We don't necessarily get the data by. It's not easy to tease out fees associated with consumables. I think that's what I'm saying, but it looks like that the fees associated with classes would not exceed $200,000 district wide, and it's probably almost half of that when you take out things that are not actually directed at consumables. And so, you know, as you look here at the previous schedules, you see, okay, there's fees associated with certain classes, but that doesn't mean it's a fee associated with a thing that is required for that class. Sometimes it can be a testing fee associated with an AP class. Sometimes it's an activity associated with that class. And so it's not as simple as just kind of wiping an entire column off the chart. It's going to be a little bit more textured work than that. The other question that was asked was about ASB cards. And I think it was Chair Daniels, was it, that was asking about the possibility of making ASB cards free for all students, not just, as the law now requires, free and reduced price lunch eligible students. So let me walk you through these numbers just a little bit. So the $215,000 that's under the first bullet there, that is the total revenue that we see associated with all ASB cards before the change in the law, right? So that was when all students were offered an ASB card. Based on some approximations, it looks like about $100,000 of that is associated with students who are free and reduced price lunch eligible. Well, as you know, because of our conversation at the last board work session, we can't charge that now anyway. So those students will be exempt as a function of the new law, leaving about $115,000, you know, and this is give or take because you have more or less students in a given year buy the card. But about $150,000 worth of revenue associated with students not eligible for free and reduced price lunch. Now, as I indicated before, we, in consultation with Dr. Harmon and with the superintendent's support, we decided that was an important thing to do this year, given all that transpired. It is a different conversation to think about as like a long-term commitment of the district. But that is at least gives you a sense of the size. Director Daniels, I believe you asked not only about the cards, but then also about the gate receipts. That was a little more difficult to get at. And I received an email 4 minutes before we got on the call here. So I don't want you to see my email. Just to give you an idea, the total universe of gate receipts for the whole district, whether that involve athletics, activities, you go to a play, you go to whatever it be, it's probably in the range of about $130,000 for a typical school year. So we had to go back in history a little bit. Now, what's going to happen is, again, because of the new law, some percentage of that is exempt going forward anyway, right? So if we're doing head math and we use the same percentages here, you could be talking about, $70,000, $60,000, $70,000 of additional costs associated with just saying that basically there are no charges. But, I urge a little bit of caution in that just because we exempt the fee doesn't mean these costs go away. And it gets to be a little bit complicated in terms of just calling around, asking some colleagues about this. The interplay between the general fund and the ASB fund is supposed to be self-standing. And it's supposed to be run by the students, and there's supposed to be these sorts of fundraising efforts to sustain that program. So there are some things to think about. We took it on this year as like a COVID related change, but there might be some regulatory considerations in terms of a permanent policy. The other question, and I forget who asked it, I believe it might have been member Vingadaslam, was with regards to the lunch fees that, so was it member Vingadaslam, if anybody remembers, but people were asking about the fees charged for lunch, how that works, and what it would cost to kind of extend beyond the existing SEP program that we're about to engage in. Because remember, we're about to more than double the number of schools. Is that right, Jewel? Is it more than it's effectively a doubling? I think it went from 5 to 12, was it?
Yep, it's more than double.
Yeah. So that in and of itself is a pretty significant structural change to our child nutrition program in the district. But you know, the question of how to provide additional subsidies, I would encourage it on two fronts. First of all, there is a bill in the legislature right now that appears to have some legs and may in fact pass, which will provide state funding to eliminate the copay for all reduced price lunch eligible students. I believe you got that right, across the state. And originally thinking that bill did not have legs. It apparently does, and may in fact pass this year. The other thing is that to the extent that the board has an interest in like universal access, that really is what the SEP program is. So it's hard for me to kind of think about it outside of the construct of the SEP program. And it would be a question of the district's eligibility for full participation in SEP. And my understanding is that the 12 schools that are participating, it's because they exceeded a certain threshold, free and reduced lunch or direct certification threshold for that eligibility. But once you kind of exceed that level, you trip into the category that it is doesn't pencil out the same way, I suppose. It's the way to say that. So, Dr. Harmon, did you want to add anything to that conversation about free reduced price lunch eligibility?
So I think when we kind of took a deeper look at this, it may turn out that this is a priority and interest of the board as a collective group that we engage in this path. My suggestion or recommendation might be that we wait to engage in this in the 22-23 school year, just to see how the onset of the addition of the 12 schools in CEP pans out. In addition to the state legislature, it does look like the bill has passed and will sit on the governor's desk for signing with the removal of copays for reduced price lunch students and that funding, to see then where the district stands in terms of evaluating our new cost of what it would look like if we were to eliminate lunch fees for all students or engage in a full district CEP plan. After we had some investigation of kind of a new reality for Kent School District, especially post-COVID. So
yeah, and so some of these proposals are there's a short-term consideration and there's a long-term consideration. So the short-term consideration is you may in fact, I think, for example, on the class fee front, you may in fact be able to make a pretty robust case that those are ESSER eligible. I think there's a strong argument to be made there in terms of eliminating barriers for return to classroom instruction, et cetera, et cetera. But the other thing to consider is it is a permanent part of our structure. So when you get on the back end of this in 3 years, and you subsidized it with ESSER funds, you know, you'd have to have a philosophy about, okay, well, is the district going to make that ask in the next levy so that, you know, can we continue that practice? So, you know, you're left you're left with, does the general fund kind of assume that cost on the back end of ESSER? And, when you're talking about one of these, maybe that's something that you can nuance. But when you're talking about, 3 or 4 of these, all fairly large structural parts of our school district, all kind of coming to a close on the back end of ESSER, that's the kind of cliff that both financial and policy wise, that could be a shock to the district. And it is a discussion about, is it a long-term general fund obligation, and what is it coming at the cost of? Is it, because those are trade-offs, right? Any questions that you might have about our attempted response to some of your questions before I move on?
I have a couple, Mr. Rarick. Could you go back to the slide where you showed the class fees?
Yes.
And it said, so I saw that you said that we had worked to consolidate those fees and make it kind of equal across the board.
Well, I would still say,
because I'm looking at differences, like I'm just trying to understand. So for example, I'm wondering why the AP class charge is only the first couple of Kent Ridge has one, and then the other high schools don't have one.
Yeah.
And then at the art class, Kent Lake has one. So I'm just trying to understand.
Mm-hmm. I can reflect. Oh, go ahead, Jill.
So I would say that some of this is, so one, we're not quite there yet in terms of having an equal representation. So I think that this is a conversation about like equality versus equity. And so in having an equal representation of the same exact fee across our buildings, one of the reasons why this may exist this way and appear unequal is that an AP course may be offered at one building and not offered at another building. And so then the necessary materials would not need to be charged in one building, but need to be charged in another building. So that's where the AP course is an example. And so we haven't quite gotten to that place of having the deeper conversation with our schools about what does equality look like in fees, and then how does that equity play a role in this in terms of the philosophy. And I think that's where you as a board, and we talked about stepping into this policy work of this to help us set that stage of what is our philosophy. So for example, it could be a philosophy of Kent School District to subsidize 10% of every additional course. So some of the things that are needed for AP are set by College Board, not necessarily the district. But it could be a philosophy of Kent School District that we will subsidize regardless of community or ability to pay or any of that, that we would subsidize 20% of that for every school, for every family, or every student that participates. And then with the remaining 80%, an additional amount may be subsidized depending on the free and reduced lunch percentage of your building, possibly. There's all kinds of philosophies for that, but that may be one reason why you see some of the disparities there. That's not every reason, but we're looking to get to a more balanced place with our fees. And that's why I said engaging in that conversation with our principals to set a more kind of cohesive look. And I think one of the first steps was putting it all together on one page and seeing it side by side, and then engaging the principals in that conversation of what does this look like when you are a family who maybe goes to a community event or to a church meeting or something, and you have a conversation with a neighbor and it's like, wait a minute, or a friend, it's like, wait, your child doesn't pay for such and such, mine does. And so what does that look like as a system? And so how our board can help us, especially because it's related to budget, everything that a school is not charging for, we then supplement out of the general fund. So thinking about then where that trade-off is, it's not like it disappears and becomes free. It's just how does it play out? And AP is a great example of that, because that doesn't just extend to the course materials, it extends to the tests. Right. And so then, there's the $95 approximately for every test. And then how far do we extend that? Do we not? There are different philosophies for different districts around that piece as well. And so that's where.
But I'm looking at like parking fees, right? Even parking passes are different. Tickets are different. Lock replacement's different. So I mean, those aren't things that are those aren't class contingent, right? Those are just not. So I'm like, all of those are very different. And so to me, that'd be kind of a no-brainer. I mean, do you know what I'm saying? And as principals, I think the parking one I can speak to only because I remember being a part of that conversation. I think the whole parking piece initially started with, well, there's limited parking spaces at some buildings. And so how do you then
make that available? What does that look like? And I understand the equity considerations and problems that brings when you charge a fee for that. But I think principals were, in their best attempts and best thinking, trying to figure out how to balance limited supply with extensive demand in terms of the need for parking spaces and not as many as needed available.
But tickets are different too, right? So a parking ticket's different. So I mean, you know what I'm saying?
Right, and absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, so there's that's where that's where the philosophy comes in of what do we believe, what are our intentions, and then how do we sustain that? And I'm sorry, Director Hamada, you had a hand up.
I actually had one more question.
Okay. I'm sorry, Director Danielson, go ahead.
That's okay. The other question I wanted to talk about is when I had mentioned, I was the one who did mention about the gate fees. And so my question was not necessarily, because I think I heard you say something about, maybe you can say what you said again about those particular fees. But my question was, so if you have someone like families who may qualify for free and reduced lunch, and it's a barrier for them if you've got a family of 4 to pay that fee to get in to watch your child play, is a barrier. So not necessarily eliminating every gate fee, but again, looking at the difference between what would happen if we were to, be able to support these families with some sort of card pass or whatever that looked like, not necessarily for everyone.
Yeah. So I'm glad. Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah.
So our interpretation of the new law is that we have to do that. So the law goes beyond just the ASB card for free and reduced lunch eligible to actually speak specifically to family members attending events. So we're interpreting that to mean, and again, it hasn't come up yet, right? But we're interpreting that to mean that those family members will be given free admission. The problem that has posed for all school districts, and I think Auburn has had similar sort of challenge as we all have, is it's interesting to think about how that actually happens at the stadium, in terms of a long line of parents and whether you have a system or that has been a challenge that all districts are kind of trying to work together on, because that information is confidential and yet it's important to what's happening in that moment. And we have staff in the district working on that issue, but the law was not vague on that point.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, I know.
Then Director Hamada and Director Benno both have questions, and we have like 2 minutes, literally. So Director Hamada, and then
I'll try to be quick. I would think with all these choices, it would be good to include the community in some type of discussion. Like if we're thinking about these changes, maybe sending out some surveys or town halls to say, if these are some of the choices we make, I'd like to have the community's input on that. Just a suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think if I can add to the conversation here, just to give you a sense for kind of where we are in the journey. Just before March of last year, when we all were sent to the virtual environment, was when really we put this schedule together for the first time. The first time we showed the principals, they were like, well, the schedule is inaccurate. We said, well, we got it straight from your staff. I mean, it was literally the first time that a schedule of this kind even existed to be able to say, like, look at the differences here, right? So in deference and respect to the principals, they need an opportunity to kind of process what we're processing, because this schedule is a new addition to our system. But we did have one long and robust conversation about the difference between what we don't want are families being charged different amounts for essentially the same thing or same class. That is different than classes that do qualitatively different things or clubs that do qualitatively different things. So particularly true in the ASB environment. You might have a club or an activity or a chorus that, because it's student-led, is much more ambitious and has a fee that's different. And you don't really want to centralize that and mandate everything across the board and have, unintended consequences that way either. So it's a deep and rich discussion, but it's time to have it.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're at time. I just wanted Director Benno to have an opportunity to express this question, so at least we can have it for the record and then address it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Later.
For me, there's just a couple things. I would love for you to show this to student leaders and see what they think, because my guess to you is there's going to be a lot of input that you'll get from students when they look at fees from different schools, and they'll talk a lot about equity and how fair that is. So that's the first thing I would recommend. The second thing is just like when I look at course fees, and if I'm a student who can't afford, I'm like, oh man, I really want to take French, but I can't afford this. Then what's going to happen is the classes are going to become more homogenized. And then when we're talking about equity in classes and equity in coursework and equity in students being in certain types of classes, then I think that kind of skews that a little bit. I think we need to be very cautious about course fees as we talk about equity and making it available for all students. So I want to put that out there too, because I'm having my equity lens on for everything. And I think that's a really important way to look at it. So that's it, because we don't have time, but I can get more into that, but that's for another time.
All right, so at this time, thank you so much for the presentation, Mr. Rarick and Dr. Harmon. We are going to adjourn into executive session at this time. Thank you all. Good. All right, we have adjourned our executive session, and at this time, we are going to adjourn into an exempt session for approximately 13 minutes. I'm letting Karen know to move us back.
President Daniels,
Yes,
I would like you all to click on the breakout room icon.
that's right, to join the breakout room. Sorry about
Put
that.
yourself back in the room.
Okay, thank you.
It's at the bottom of your screen. It looks like 4 squares, breakout rooms. If you click on it,
I don't have 4 squares at the bottom of my screen.
you don't have anything that says breakout room. Are you in full screen view? Go up to the top right corner and exit full screen.
Okay, there we go. Thank you.
And then there's a button and it'll take you back to the room.
My apologies, I was muted. So good evening. I'd like to welcome you to our regularly scheduled board meeting. I'd like to call it to order right now at 7:01. Director Vengadassalam is absent and excused this evening. So at this time, I will invite Director Benno to please say the Pledge of Allegiance.
Thank you. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you so much. At this time, I'd like to welcome our audience to our meeting. And Director Hamada, would you please read our land acknowledgement for the evening?
Yes, thank you, President Daniels. As a board, we acknowledge in a district we are gathered upon the ancestral lands of the Muckleshoot Indian tribe, who historically lived throughout the area between the Cascade Mountains and Puget Sound.
Thank you so much. So welcome. This is a meeting of the Kent School District Board, which is held in public to comply with the Open Public Meetings Act. Our process for audience participation is as follows. The purpose of board meetings is for the board to conduct its business in public. During the meeting, the board will listen to but not respond to comments from the audience. Those wishing to comment must complete the online form as indicated on the district website and in BoardDocs. Tonight, there will be 2 periods where public comment will be heard, at the beginning of the meeting and at the end of the meeting. Questions raised through submitted public comment addressing an issue may require further investigation, and staff will contact you to follow up. If you indicated a desire to speak to an agenda item, your comment will be read at that portion of the agenda. General comments tonight will be read during the audience communication sections of the agenda. Dr. Watts, are there any changes to tonight's agenda?
Thank you, President Daniels. There are no changes to tonight's agenda.
Thank you. We're on to agenda item 2.0, preliminary communication from the audience. Ms. Howley, do we have any public comments?
President Daniels, we have 3 comments for this portion of the agenda and 1 that would like to speak specifically to 8.01.
Okay.
So I will read 3 comments.
Thank you.
The first one is from Soraya Bai. And Soraya says, speaking on the resolution number 1602, emergency waiver of high school graduation credits that is going to be talked about in the virtual regular meeting at 7:00 p.m. What will be the requirements a student will need to have in order to be able to fill out the emergency waiver? A lot of students, especially now during the pandemic, have been severely affected mentally, making it harder to do simple tasks for school. In the end, most of these students have been struggling to keep their grades up, many worrying about whether they will be able to graduate or not. My main concern is if these waivers will include as a requirement to be mental health issues. The second comment is from Carson Kohler. Carson says, I am a senior at Kentwood High School. Due to the pandemic, we have had no typical senior year with all of the activities that seniors enjoy. Governor Inslee has stated that school districts can return to in-school learning with mandated requirements. Our graduation ceremony is extremely isolating for the seniors with little fanfare. With COVID restrictions lifting, will anything be changing for our graduation ceremony? The next comment is from Desmaria Gomez. And it's a question that asks, what does the 725 screening include? Those were the 3 comments. I will read the 1 comment at 8.01.
Thank you, Ms. Howley. At this time, we are on to agenda item 3.0, our superintendent report. Dr. Watts.
Yes, thank you, President Daniels, members of the board, staff, and Ms. Howley. First of all, I want to recognize that these are unprecedented times. And as we have accomplished what's seemingly impossible, I would like to share just a few highlights, updates, and information that's important, particularly as we begin our return to in-person hybrid learning. So this evening, I am incredibly excited. I am more than excited to not only say hello and welcome back again to our students, to our staff, and our families. As a reminder, and as we all remember, on Monday, many of us had the extreme pleasure to visit schools, to welcome back students, families, and staff, to share in the excitement and the anticipation that was buzzing around all of our elementary school K-6 campuses within our Team KSD community as hybrid learning began. Now, I have since been able to visit several more schools and many classroom environments as we continue settling into our new health and safety protocols, our new schedules, our new learning model that also incorporates the use of technology in new ways. Now, this newness certainly is not new to us. Actually, our school buildings reopened for inspiration for the first time in over a year. And in that time, nearly 7,000 K-6 students joined us on Monday. About half of our elementary students across the district chose hybrid learning for the remainder of the year. And of course, things look and feel different at school right now. We know that. And we could not do several things that we were so used to. We could not high five, we could not hug, we could not see each other as we normally would. We could only see those smiling eyes above the masks instead of the actual smiles of excitement that we'd become so used to seeing on the first days of school in the past. But the kindness, compassion, the innovation, and the joy for learning and teaching and serving students and families was as present as ever before. Now, next week, as we have heard and we know, our pre-K and our secondary students, grades 7 through 12, will join in the hybrid learning model. Again, with nearly half of all students at all grade levels choosing hybrid learning. And with approximately half of our students learning on campus again, this means about half, again, of our students are continuing to learn remotely. Now, while the hybrid learning model and schedules do allow our schools to maximize social distancing and health and safety in our school buildings, we do also understand that not all families yet feel comfortable in having their students return to our school buildings in order to learn. Now, achieving this blended model of learning has been no small accomplishment. It has taken the small and mighty acts of many. And while this transition has not been perfect, we know that. Our goal is to continue making perfect progress, and we continue to address individual family needs and concerns. And while this transition has not been perfect again, we know that all of their needs and concerns as a whole, our entire district remains committed to our priority of keeping our students and our staff safe while focusing on teaching and learning with an emphasis on learning. And for this reason, I want to again thank all of our staff members, our Team KSD members. I want to thank all of our labor partners. I want to thank all of those who have continued to come to the table throughout this pandemic, to work together, to collaborate, to seek new and innovative solutions. And I especially want to thank all of our families, our students, those who've worked tirelessly beside our educators to support our students. We are in this together, and we know that together we can make this positive, healthy, and safe end of our school year. Now, as we transition both in our learning models and more fully into the spring weather, we also we cannot lose sight of the fact that COVID-19 is still an active threat in our community. So please continue to wear your masks, wash your hands, watch your distance, and stay home when you are ill. And for those students and staff learning and teaching at school, please remember to complete your wellness form each day as we continue to see the COVID-19 activity levels rise in our region and around our state. I want to be sure we are also prepared to transition back to a remote learning model for a classroom or an entire building if there is a confirmed outbreak. Now, what is an outbreak? An outbreak is defined as 2 or more confirmed cases that are not linked. Now, classroom and school closure decisions due to an outbreak will be made in partnership with Seattle King County Public Health. And that is our promise, that is our practice, and that is our support for our students and our staff and families to make sure that we're teaching and we're learning in a safe environment. Now, in other exciting news this week, our partnership with Kingmakers of Oakland is taking another step forward as 17 leaders from the classroom to the boardroom, including myself, will be attending the virtual spring symposium to discuss and to create action plans that address the systems, the structures, the culture, and the conditions that lead to improved educational and life outcomes for African-American students from pre-K to 12th grade. Next month, we will begin a student listening tour based on our work with Kingmakers. Now, this listening tour is an extension of our district-wide listening sessions that we've been conducting with partners serving families of color, and as listening sessions are now an embedded practice of our diversity, equity, and inclusion work that should ultimately lead to a greater sense of belonging for all of us. And now, with springtime in full bloom, not only is this a time for sunshine and learning, but even as we adjust to the new hybrid schedule, our leaders and staff are also simultaneously planning for our next school year. So I do look forward to additional upcoming opportunities to engage with our board, staff members, and our community in our continuous improvement cycle of plan, do, study, and act. Now, as we both prepare for next year while also continuing to support our students and our families this school year, I want to remind each and every one of us that we are doing what is perceived to be impossible. And by that, I mean, we've never been in this situation before. Certainly, we are in the midst of a global pandemic, and we are continuing to improve our ability and our willingness to ensure that teaching and learning occurs in every classroom, in every school building, for every member of Team KSD. Now, again, we are not perfect. And again, we are charged with making perfect progress, and we will. This is a pledge to our students and our families. And I want to say on behalf of Team KSD, thank you. Thank you for your continued patience, your partnership, and your understanding. I hope you and your families all stay safe and healthy during this global health crisis. President Daniels, thank you. That concludes my report for this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Watts. At this time, we are on to our agenda item 4.0, and I apologize. Director Ringadossalam is not here, so we will not be having our legislative update for this evening. We're on to agenda item 5.01, our proclamations. And for Public School Volunteer Week, Director Hamada, would you please read that proclamation?
I would be glad to. Whereas public school volunteers contribute unselfishly to the success of students, teachers, and support staff, and whereas school volunteers reflect the highest values of our democratic society by representing people of all ages and all walks of life, and whereas school volunteers stretch school and district resources to ensure that every student receives help and encouragement according to need. And whereas school volunteers exhibit care, model the best in citizenship, and create a climate that fosters learning and love of education. Whereas Public School Volunteer Week provides a yearly opportunity for schools and families to honor and highlight the powerful contributions parents and caregivers provide at school and home to support student success. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Board of Directors of the Kent School District recognizes April 19th through the 23rd, 2021 as Public School Volunteer Week in the Kent School District and urges all citizens to join in remembering the dedication and hard work of local volunteers in preparing today's students for tomorrow's world. Signed this 14th day of April 2021 by our Board of Directors and our Superintendent.
Thank you, Director Hamada. At this time, we're on to 5.02, our proclamation for National Student Leadership Week. Gosh, I can't talk. Director Benno, would you please read that proclamation?
Oh, yes, of course. National Student Leadership Week. Whereas National Student Leadership Week, NSLW, is a theme-based week dedicated to recognizing and supporting the important role of student leaders. Since 1972, the National Office of the National Association of Student Councils, National Honor Society, and National Junior Honor Society have sponsored National Student Leadership Week. And whereas student leaders are a positive influence on their peers, modeling good character and scholarship in and out of the classroom, and serve as change agents to improve the overall climate and academic performance levels of their schools. And whereas the support of school administrators and faculty, parents, and community members is necessary to help student leaders develop the essential traits and characteristics of a leader and to provide positive experiences to expand their skills and ensure the successful education of all emerging student leaders. And whereas the theme of National Student Leadership Week 2021 is Leadership Unlimited, because students have an opportunity to use their creativity and perseverance to overcome challenges they have never seen before. And whereas National Student Leadership Week serves as an ideal time to bring attention to the important and integral contribution of student leaders toward the future of our schools, cities, nation, and world. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Board of Directors of the Kent School District recognizes April 18th through 24, 2021 as National Student Leadership Week in Kent School District and urges all citizens to join this observance. Signed this 14th day of April 2021 by the Board of Directors and Superintendent.
Thank you so much, Director Benno. At this time, we're on to agenda item 5.03, our proclamation for Administrative Professionals Week. Vice President Benninger, would you please read that?
Absolutely. Whereas Administrative Professionals Week recognizes the many roles and responsibilities of the administrative professionals in our schools and district offices, and whereas the Kent School District Board of Directors acknowledges the critical role of administrative professionals to supporting the education of our students and ensuring that students are successfully prepared for their futures, and whereas administrative professionals work in the district's 42 school buildings, the transportation building, and the central administration campus, and whereas our administrative professionals are often the first impression and the face of Kent School District to the thousands of parents, community members, and students that walk in the doors of our schools and offices or call on the telephone, and therefore serve as key frontline public relations ambassadors. And whereas the school board recognizes the expertise and dedication of the district's administrative professionals, their work to master technology and effectively utilize communication skills, their vital contributions and commitment to teamwork, and their willingness to learn and accept new challenges and opportunities. And whereas the school board wishes to commend each and every one of Kent School District's administrative professionals and their service to students, staff, parents, and community members each and every day. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Board of Directors of the Kent School District proclaims April 8th to 24th, 2021, Administrative Professionals Week in Kent School District and urges all citizens to join in this observance. Signed this 14th day of April by the Board of Directors, Kent School District, and Dr. Calvin J. Watts, Secretary to the Board.
Thank you so much, Vice President Benninger. At this time, we're on to our agenda item 6, our Board of Directors items for discussion and approval. The first item is agenda item 6.01, the resolution number 1601, issuance of contracts for certificated supervisory employees. Is there a motion?
I move that we approve 6.01, resolution number 1601, issuance of contracts for certificated supervisory employees.
I second.
Okay, it has been moved and seconded. Is there a discussion? Hearing none, I'll call for the vote. All those in favor of approving agenda item 6.01, resolution number 1601, issuance of contracts for certificated supervisory employees, please indicate by raising your right hand and saying aye.
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 All those opposed indicate by raising your right hand and saying no. Any abstention? The motion carries. We're on to agenda item 6.02, resolution number 1602, emergency waiver of high school graduation credits. Is there a motion?
I move that we approve the resolution number 1602, emergency waiver of high school graduation credits.
I second.
Okay, it has been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, I'll call for the vote. All those in favor of approving agenda item 6.02, the resolution number 1602 for the emergency waiver of high school graduation credits, please indicate by raising your right hand and saying aye.
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 All those opposed indicate by raising your right hand and saying no. Is there any abstentions? The motion carries. We're on to 6.03, resolution number 1603, issuance of contracts for certificated non-supervisory employees. Is there a motion?
I move that we approve resolution number 1603, issuance of contracts for certificated non-supervisory employees.
I second.
Okay, it has been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, I'll call for the vote. All those in favor of approving agenda item 6.03, resolution number 1603, issuance of contracts for certificated non-supervisory employees, please indicate by raising your right hand and saying aye.
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 All those opposed indicate by raising your right hand and saying no. Any abstention? The motion carries. Agenda item 6.04, the second reading and approval for the revised policy 3416, medication at school. Is there a motion?
I move that we approve second reading and approval for revised policy 1316, medication at schools.
I second.
Okay. Do we need to correct it? 3416. Just so
Oh,
it's corrected in the minute. It's okay.
I need my glasses. Thank you.
All right. It has been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, I will call for the vote. All of those in favor of approving agenda item 6.04, the second reading and approval, revised policy 3416 for medication at school, please indicate by raising your right hand and saying aye.
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 Any opposed, please raise your right hand and say no. Any abstentions? The motion carries. 6.05, the RFI for position management, award of contract. Is there a motion?
I move that we approve 6.05 RFI for position management award of contract.
I second.
Okay, it has been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion?
I do have a question on this one, and please forgive me. I have had internet connectivity issues for like 2 weeks now, so I didn't get a chance to submit this, so I will understand if there isn't an answer. But my question is this, does this system link up with our payroll system?
So
Sorry, I think I'm muted.
Okay.
All right, apologies.
Thank you, Sushant.
So thank you for the question, Vice President Bettinger. Good evening, President Daniels, members of the board, Dr. Watts, Ms. Howley. So this system does not link directly to payroll. There's a process that takes the information and reports from here, and then they get entered directly into payroll. We've gone over the process with the vendor, and so we have a pretty good idea of what the process looks like.
Okay. So did you look at other, just curious, because I'm a nerd about HRIS systems.
Understood.
So did you look at other vendors that have all the different modules, including what we're adding on to?
As part of our RFI process, we had 2 people respond. We put our RFI twice because the first time we had no respondents. The second time we had the Kronos company, which actually does timesheets and those types of things, as well as the front line. We reviewed, went through our rubric, and came up with the solution that really covered everything from position management to position requisitions, job postings, hiring, onboarding, staff evaluations, and then blend them with our current models for professional growth and substitute management. So with that, this product came out on top, because currently our HR staff spends a significant amount of time navigating spreadsheets to bring all this information together. And this product brings it into a single pane of glass, so to speak.
Okay, so it'll help. It's going to make things easier for communicating with the payroll system.
It's going to make everything easier with communicating to the payroll system, as well as being able to forecast out in the future on vacancies and those types of things as well.
Cool. Thank you.
Mr. Christie, or whoever can answer this, I need just a little bit of clarification on this. I looked at this, and presently, I guess I'd kind of like to know, it's pretty much a big ticket item as I see it, maybe not in a huge budget, but the one-time fee and the yearly fee. I'm wondering if you can tell me, what was the reasoning to add this? Did we not have a present system that was functioning? Does this add and save us money down the road? Is it, I see where it says retention in there too. Is that because you get more data that you're receiving with this? If you could help me clarify exactly what all this is about, I'd appreciate it.
So I
may really quickly just speak to the budgeting piece of this. So yes, I will not say that approximately $400,000 is not a big expense for a school district, but it is less than 1% of our overall budget. And when we spend 80 to 85% of our budget on staffing, it is extremely important that we are able to know exactly where we're spending, how we're spending, and if we're spending efficiently and effectively. And so I think this speaks to that portion of it. And then I will defer to Mr. Christie for additional explanation, but I just wanted to say that this is definitely an investment in our largest expense.
Yeah. And so thank you for the question, Director Amata. So as we work towards continuous improvement, especially in our data systems, this platform allows us to make some significant strides in unifying our data systems to make sure that we have a continuous stream of data from entry to exit. Because what I was describing before with being able to do position management and requisitions, this system also allows us to handle everything from posting the positions, right? From a job requisition to posting the position, to the onboarding of the position, to the workflow, and then towards the end, once someone separates. So it's an entire user lifecycle system of employee management. And a lot of those different aspects are handled through a combination of spreadsheets, emails, and those types of things, which is pretty standard for smaller districts. But once we get into a district of our size, it becomes more important for us to be able to unify those systems so that we can do a certain amount of not only prediction of current state, but also to take a look back into 3 months ago, 6 months ago, and see where we were and compare those to a year. So as we expand our data systems again, and as we continue to improve our processes, this solution fits very nicely into that whole package. Hopefully that answers your question.
And that draws me to another question, because software usually has several different applications that people are putting out there. Why did you focus on this particular one?
So we were already using two of the pieces that are associated from this company. It was the professional growth and our substitute management. So professional growth platform and a substitute management platform. And with those two, if you're tracking employees from end to end, professional growth, which also includes, as a part of this purchase, evaluations, right, and tracking, and the recruiting and hiring, it allows us to have everything in a single place, which makes the data transfer between modules a lot easier. Currently, we have secondary systems and secondary processes that move the data from one system to another system, which creates a lot of duplicate entry, triplicate entry, and we're trying to avoid that as much as possible. So the less entry points that we have, the more accurate our data is. And so from that point, this system allows us to do a lot of that work easier.
And do I hear you saying it? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but this particular application is one of the best that's out there, the only one that's out there? I mean, I honestly don't know. Or it's the high end, the low end, or whatever.
So I would say that the system is on the high end, but more importantly, it's built with K-12 in mind. Some of the other systems are built enterprise, which have different operations, different budget structures, different position structures. This was built with K-12 in mind. A lot of very large districts use this system and use it quite effectively.
Thank you very much. It gives me a good, clear picture of what you're talking about. Thank you.
Any other discussion? Hearing none, I will call for the vote. All those in favor of approving agenda item 6.05, RFI for Precision Management, the award of contract, please indicate by raising your right hand and saying aye.
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 All those opposed indicate by raising your right hand and saying no. Any abstentions? The motion carries. Agenda item 6.06, the contract to Daktronics for Mill Creek Middle School Reader Board. Is there a motion?
I move that we approve the contract to Daktronics for Mill Creek Middle School Reader Board.
I second.
Okay, it has been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, I will call for the vote. All of those in favor of approving agenda item 6.06, the contract to Daktronics for Mill Creek Middle School Reader Board, please indicate by raising your right hand and saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed indicate by raising your right hand and saying no. Are there any abstentions? The motion carries. We're on to our consent agenda. Is there any item that a director would like to pull for discussion of the consent agenda? And hearing none, I will ask for a motion to approve our consent agenda, items 7.01 through 7.08.
I move that we approve consent agenda items 7.01 through 7.08.
I second.
Okay, it has been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, I will call for the vote. All those in favor of approving our consent agenda, items 7.01 through 7.08, please indicate by raising your right hand and saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed indicate by raising your right hand and saying no. Any abstentions? The motion carries. We're on to our informational part of the agenda. And I believe there is a comment that was to be read for agenda item 8.01. Is that right, Ms. Howley?
Yes, President Daniels. This comment is from Mustafa Al-Askari. And he has a couple of questions. Will there be hybrid learning for the 2021-2022 school year? If so, what would be different to support those students who choose to stay online? And that's the end of the comment.
Thank you so much. All right, is there any question about our informational items? Sorry.
Protecting you.
He has a
Obviously,
question.
he has a question.
Yeah.
8.01, it's a micro K-12, whenever it pops up, every time it pops up, I just have to say, I just feel like I'm just confused why if there are no other options out there for saving some money. So it's not really a question, it's just a comment.
Okay. So we're on to our agenda item 9, our communication, and we have no final communication from the audience. So we will move on to 9.02, board reports and discussion. Who would like to begin?
I'll go first tonight, I guess. First of all, I want to do my shout outs to all the virtual parental classes that are free that the school district is offering. I have been on about 3 of them and I found them to be excellent. They're just kind of, a periphery of what is to come if you want to take it deeper. But I found them very helpful, and the way they have it set up is you can ask all kinds of questions to the person that presents, but nobody knows exactly, because some of these items are pretty personal. There's no names disclosed or anything like that, but you still get your question answered. And then they're offering a lot more further detailed help in these areas. And I just learned so much about prescription drugs, narcotics, and alcohol addiction. And again, those that were offered more help going forward that attended, they could certainly do that. I also, in one of the sessions, I increased my knowledge on LGBTQ issues and terms, and that helps me to be a better board director and understanding, the different terms and how I need to be equitable and how I'm approaching that. So I'm increasing my knowledge to help be a better director, which helps the district. And I learned at another session on human trafficking, all the different things that are going on in that area. And it's just pretty amazing and pretty kind of frightening out there. But again, in each session, they had people attending because I could see the participation. So I can see how worthwhile and how much this could add to our social and emotional beyond the classroom for parents during the pandemic and just ongoingly. So I'm very impressed with those virtual parental classes led by a lot of our partners. And then I want to give a shout out to all the parents and everybody who had attended the Ombudsman and the South King County Coalition meetings on the 30th for us continuing that conversation. And at that conversation, many things happened, but there was a person that was actually interested in a board position that is coming up in the November 21 period of time for election. And I called that gentleman. Well, I actually offered to help him. He called me and we had a long chat on the phone. And so lots of things come from these sessions beyond what even the topics are, because we really do need some people to step up for these new board positions and, help our community and help our students. And I want to give a shout out to our administrators led by Dr. Calvin Watts in various buildings and staff that made our back to school in-person return to our elementary level such a professional and compassionate return. I was out there and I intend to be out to every elementary school eventually. I can only do a couple of morning because they're close time. But the schools that I did visit and watched them come in and watched them line up, watched them get to their dots, watched them wear their mask, watched them 3 feet apart, watched everybody kind of just, some of them were dazed jumping out of the car. And on a couple of the elementaries, the lineup on the first day was pretty interesting, but they moved them in and they moved them out. And I was at Sawyer Woods, Grass Lake, and Covington Elementary. So a big shout out to the principals, Tim Helligan, Steve Thatcher, and then the second day was out at Covington Elementary, and Zarita Williams, who is just a bundle of energy. And we just had a ball just greeting all those kids, and she was hugging them. She was actually hugging them a little bit. And Vice Principal Chastain, who I've connected with in the last week, and interesting to see him out there and learn more about him. And of course, Dr. Wade Banniger from administration added to the group there at Covington, and Janice of Custodial Services and all the staff. And then there was Tim. I talked to him at the security guard out at Grass Lake. So it is a team effort. And what I'm saying, from every angle, you're seeing people caring about their kids, coming back, doing the professional work. And that shows great organizational skills. And on top of that, it's a real desire to have each one of our kids feel like they're welcome back to school, which has been quite an undertaking here for quite some time. And let's see, and I'm excited to see the opening of the middle school and high school and hope to be out there in person. And it just made me as a person feel like I was actually out in society again, to be out functioning again instead of on the front of a computer. So that was an additive to me. We did a reading for the kids, and I read to Sunrise Elementary, and I read the book I Promised by LeBron James. And it's quite an interesting book, and it was. I'm glad I chose that because the kids seem to enjoy it. But I spoke to their librarian out there. They didn't have copies of this. So I made sure they have 3 new copies in their library of I Promise by LeBron James. And that shows the kids in that book a lot of illustrations of kids that are going to our schools. So I think that's great to have in our library and increases our equity. I also want to do a shout out to Amanda Gaskin. She's one of our social workers at Kent East Hill Elementary for the great work she's doing in helping a family. You may not be aware, it was in the Kent Reporter, but one of our families with 3 children that are attending Kent East Hill had their rental home completely burned down and they lost everything. I mean, everything. And so it was interesting to work with her through another hat I wear and see our community involvement have stepped up and given that family, you know, gas cards, food cards. Some service clubs have stepped up to pay for temporary housing till they can get into permanent housing. But it's just another shout out to our community. What a giving community we have. I'm looking forward to attending the sessions put on by Kingsmakers in the next 3 days. I plan to attend that. And that will help and continue our work, making our school district a more equitable place to be at. And as I always close with my quote, government institutions exist because the community feels there is a need to be developed for the common good. When decision makers of those institutions fail to listen to their constituents, they fail. And thanks very much for coming and caring about our district tonight, and I wish you all the best. Good night.
Who's next?
I'm happy to go next. I want to, my shout out, thank you to everyone again who sends emails. I try to respond to all the emails as soon as I can. And I appreciate people's feedback. I love hearing from people. All feedback, I think all feedback is important. I think it's people in the community's responsibility, authority to email us and ask questions and, you know, hold us accountable. I think that's really important. So I really appreciate the messages I get and the emails I get. And for people who are watching, doing this work, I love. It's some of the people in my life are like, how can you do that? I love it. I think it's great. I think it's important, like making a difference in the community and supporting students and educators and the community, to me, is really important. So for me, thank you for everyone's support and feedback that I get via email. As far as things I've been up to, I always like to tell people what I'm doing because I think it's important to kind of know like what we're up to, like on top of like my full-time job. Like I do this work, but I also make room to meet with people and talk with people. King County Council member Dave Updegrove emailed me asking to chat. I learned a lot about how the county government works. I'm going to be totally honest. I didn't necessarily know how the county government kind of works. So I learned about some interesting, cool opportunities for funding for education purposes that the county does. It's not very much, but there's some cool things that they offer, which I thought was cool. The Kent Educators Education Association invited me to pizza and conversation without pizza, but I'm hoping that in the future I will get to have pizza. Great to talk to educators who have political interests as well. They asked me lots of questions about kind of what I believe, what I stand for, which is, I think, great to know. I did attend the Ombuds listening session. I hope the listening sessions continue. I love listening to what's going on in the community. And I also love that it holds us accountable too. And I'm hoping that we do more equity work and more listening sessions. We had a budget and policy work session. I love looking at budget. I think it's great. I like to know what's going on. So for me, just looking at that is a great way to kind of know what's going on with our school district and funding. I did have an equity discussion with President Daniels and Dr. Watts. I hope that the district and the board itself, that we can continue to work on equity and directly and indirectly, and that it's not just something that we just talk about, check it off because it's like the right thing to do and move on, that we continue to do the work. And the work may be tough and challenging, but it needs to be done because we need to make sure that we're supporting everyone in our community. And so I just hope that continues. And I hope that as a board that we can continue to do the work and visibly, not just like by word, but by action. And so I really hope that we can continue to do that. It was a great conversation and I really hope to continue that. I attended the GLSEN LGBTQ Leadership Conference for Educators and Students on March 27th. It was a great virtual conference, lots to learn. There's always lots to learn. So it's very awesome to look at the different sessions that talk about how to make environments safe for students. If you're an educator, there were some student sessions about leadership and advocacy, which I think is important. I know that there were some educators there. I don't know about students, but I thought it was really great. I also attended, there was a Rainbow Reader Summit about literacy and age-appropriate books for elementary through high school for LGBTQ issues. There were some authors there. Gabby Rivera is an author of a book called Juliet Takes a Breath, which is like a middle high school level book. And Ernesto Javier Martinez, he's from Eugene, Oregon. He's the author of a book called Cuando Amamos Cantamos, or When We Love Someone, We Sing to Them. And he did a book reading. It was really cool. Just the importance, like literacy, and the importance of making sure that school libraries had books that were representative of LGBTQ students and topics that were age appropriate, and that there's a program called the Rainbow Library where different schools can apply to get a set of age appropriate LGBTQ themed books in their school libraries. I thought that was a really cool event to attend. And so for me, it was great. So I had a busy couple of weeks. So looking up the next couple of weeks, I really don't have anything on the agenda. So I invite people to groups, community leaders, principals, administrators, student groups, come invite me. I'm happy to do things virtually, come to listening sessions, walkthroughs. I know that because I work out of school, so sometimes it might be hard for me to come during school hours, but there's always circumstances I can make happen. I'm very disappointed I can't attend the Kingmakers event this weekend. I have a union event this weekend. I'm an elected delegate to the Representative Assembly, so I can't attend. So I'm hoping I can participate in the future and participate in the listening sessions with students. That's where my heart is. So I would love to hear what students have to say. So I would be happy and offer myself up to participate for those events. And personal note, I start in my hybrid teaching on Monday at my school. So I've been in school this week in Renton trying to get things ready for my students. So I'm excited to get some kind of firsthand knowledge so that I can bring to the board here and kind of let people know what's it like being hybrid. Because I think it's even for me working, it's kind of hard to kind of wrap my brain around it until we actually do it. And so, but beyond that, I want to thank everyone again for your support. Knowledge, education, I think is really important to participate in where you can in the community. So I want to thank everyone again.
All right, I'll go. So I think like Director Bono, there was a busy 2 weeks or so, and then spring break happened. So on the 25th, I had a phone meeting with State Superintendent Rakedahl. Specifically, I wanted to understand SR2 and SR3 funding. So I just decided to go to the source so I could try and understand it better as well. On the 29th, I met with a group of constituents who had been citizen members of the Back to School Task Force. We had a Teams meeting and had a good conversation about how all the task force meetings had worked. So it was so much fun. I decided to continue. So on the last Monday, I'm going to try having on the last Monday of every month, have meetings with constituents over Teams, because it seems to be a good way to do it right now, but hopefully someday in person having those meetings. So, because it's a personal goal of mine to reach out to the community and hear from them. So my next meeting will be on the 26th of April. So I will, anyone who wants to, any constituent or community member who wants to join, send me an email and I'll add you to my list. I was really grateful for the Ombuds listening session. And this was our third one. It's very impactful. And I'm looking, I have a little notebook that I keep of all kinds of things. And they had a community recap on March 4th, and kind of to feed off, I can't remember who just said this, but the listening and the questions they came up with on March 4th are to me just like this wonderful framework of accountability and things to focus on. And so it's in my book of just things that I have at every board meeting or when I prep for every board meeting, to understand and just kind of accountability and to ask those questions. And so I'm hoping as a board, we can even go through their questions from their March 4th session that some of which we were addressed on the 30th, but a lot were not. And so that's important work. And I really appreciate it because that's important to me to hear from the communities. We had our board work session on budget and policy, our first budget work session. And I've had a lot of conversations with parents on the phone. I also like to respond as often as possible to emails with, I literally had no internet or cable for, I think, 5 days. And then it's been spotty for a while. So it's been hard to answer emails, but phone conversations I can have much easier. I just want to thank, I know that spring break happened and I feel like there's a lot of staff that did not get a spring break. So I want to thank everyone who went above and beyond. I know there's been a lot going on. And to all our staff in the buildings now and our staff that's going to be in buildings next week, my son changed his mind. So he's going back in a building. So, but I thank you all for being there and navigating this new normal. I want to just kind of touch base too. Thank you to all our volunteers. And I know it's weird because you're not in the buildings this year. And so I'm hoping that sooner rather than later that, we'll have our volunteers back in our buildings. Student leadership, again, we acknowledge that this month. And we have a board role for a student leader. And I'm hoping that sooner rather than later, we will have our student board director and whatever that takes to, if we need to kind of look at the time commitment or whatever, that's on my heart that we have we fill that student board director role and student leadership. And one thing, when we talk about, my brain looks for patterns. And so when, the Ombuds listening sessions, one of the students said something very profound about bullying, and that sometimes the people that bully are also need help and they're being bullied elsewhere, just not at school. And it's that kind of insight and that voice that I think is so important for us as adult leaders in a school district. So I am anxious to get that going again. And then our administrative professionals, I want to thank you again, beyond just reading a statement. I know that, getting Skyward, navigating Skyward and the enrollments and all that was a lot of work. And I know in central office and things like that. So I just want to thank everyone. I also want to thank my board colleagues, as always, for participating in this work. And that's about all I have to say.
All right, thank you. I want to also acknowledge everyone that's here this evening that are watching and those that have attended. Thank you so much for your time. It's appreciated. Thank you for all the work that you do. I know preparing to go back this last week and over the last several weeks actually has been a lot of work. And so I just want to acknowledge that and thank the staff because Vice President Bender, I'm sure you're right. Many people did not get spring break and so many people have not gotten lots of breaks. And so recognizing that and appreciating that, we do appreciate what you do. Might not always feel like it, and you might not always feel appreciated. I know sometimes it gets tough, but we do appreciate everything that you do. And so thank you for that. I am very excited about kids coming back to school also. It's nice to see some smiling faces. I was able to see a lot of back to school pictures that people took. It was funny because it was almost like it was the first day of school. So some of my friends took their kids shopping for new outfits, and so just really cute. So anyway, but it's a great time, and just to see so many smiling faces on all accounts is really good. So thank you so much. I want to thank, I've heard from several students, which is very exciting to me, about their civics. Around this time, it kind of happens. You get civics time and civics class and they reach out. And so lots of great questions, lots of great conversations. So I appreciate that. Student voice is huge and important because, right, they're all our constituents. And I also want to say our staff are our constituents as well. And so it's really important to reach out to staff members and connect with them and hear from them and get their perspectives as well. So I think really kind of, being able to make sure that we are getting multiple perspectives and reaching out to multiple people and around that are all impacted by our education system is important. those voices are important as well. So also, I was able to meet with a couple of people who are considering running for board positions, and so that was great. Giving some feedback, and so hopefully we'll have some good folks step up and be able to fill some shoes that may be difficult to fill in a couple of cases. So looking forward to talking to more people and supporting that however I can. So I wish you all a good evening. And at this time, I will end my report and our meeting's adjourned. Thank you. Have a great evening.